Welcome back to the deep dive. Sometimes the most important story in global affairs isn't actually what happened, but what didn't happen. And today we're diving into, well, a stack of source material that you send us about a truly historic moment, the G20 summit of 2025.
Right.
Our mission is to move beyond the headlines. We want to unpack the complex geopolitical architecture that really defined the summit. Specifically, we're going to shortcut straight to understanding the radical implications of the United States executing a complete boycott of the whole thing.
And it wasn't just a scheduling conflict.
Not at all. This was a deliberate, an unprecedented geopolitical choice.
And that choice, it created a kind of real-time global governance laboratory. This deep dive is so crucial for you because we're looking at how global leadership works when a traditional gravitational anchor is just, abruptly removed.
The one that's defined the post-war order.
Exactly. It forces us to confront these huge questions about multipolar dynamics, the true resilience of these institutions, and really where global power is actually exercised today.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's a monumental shift. Segment 1, setting the scene, the historic absence. The U.S. chose to boycott. What did that actually look like on the ground, and what was the immediate significance for the other 19 economies at the table?
Well, historic is almost an understatement. Doesn't quite capture the severity.
Right.
Our sources confirmed this was a complete deliberate boycott. It stemmed from these deep, unresolved policy disagreements that had escalated, far beyond a typical diplomatic squabble.
That's just staggering. It implies that whatever was happening, internally or with policy was a higher priority than shaping global financial and climate policy.
Precisely. And the absence created more than just a political void. It was an immediate logistical and procedural challenge. The G20 is an administrative beast.
Of course.
You have committees, drafts, working groups. The sources highlight that the first reaction among the remaining members wasn't panic, but a scramble.
A scramble to do what?
To preserve functionality. They just couldn't afford to let the whole institutional momentum collapse simply because one powerful member decided to sit this one out.
So instead of a policy vacuum, you get a real-time stress test.
You do.
And the material suggests the other nations moved fast to sort of solidify the agenda and show that the institution was bigger than any single member.
They had to. The immediate ripple effect was twofold. First, it highlighted dependencies. Which areas really required U.S. input to succeed. But second, and I think this is more interesting, it revealed a surprising lack of dependency in other areas, particularly around cooperation among the Global South members. The spotlight shifted almost instantly from why the U.S. was absent to how the remaining 19 would seize this moment.
That reframing is key. The U.S. withdrawal wasn't just symbolic, it was a forcing function. It compelled new leadership solutions.
Yes.
And that leads us right into the defining feature of the summit. Segment 2, new leadership and the multipolar shift.
So, who stepped up? Who held that gavel, literally and symbolically? The sources are very clear on this. The heightened leadership role was played by South Africa.
Interesting.
Their diplomatic activity, their agenda-setting influence, it just surged in a way that wouldn't have been possible under the, let's say, traditional structures. They didn't just fill a chair, they steered the entire narrative.
Okay, that's the kind of detail we need to unpack. So it wasn't one of the, established heavyweights like France or Canada immediately rushing in.
Yeah.
It was a nation that actively represents a broader coalition of developing economies. What did South Africa actually do to seize that moment?
They became the clear champion for what the sources call the spirit of global South cooperation.
Right, that phrase.
And it's a crucial concept. It's not just about, geography. It's about aligning priorities. South Africa, Brazil, India, Indonesia. They rallied around concrete policy points that were relevant to their collective needs. So, for instance, the material indicates they heavily focused the conversation on reforming the global financial architecture, on addressing sovereign debt, especially for low-income countries, and on accelerating tech transfer for climate resilience.
Things that aren't always top of the list for the OECD nations.
Exactly. So this global South cooperation, it's not just diplomatic window dressing. It's a unified agenda focused on structural economic fairness and climate justice.
And if we connect that to the bigger picture, this is where you find the solid evidence, right, for these emerging multipolar power dynamics.
Well, it's undeniable evidence.
If the G20, which has historically been so dominated by the G7, suddenly starts prioritizing debt relief over, say, coordinated interest rate policy, that's a structural shift in influence.
It is. Multipolarity isn't just the rise of China or Russia, it's the increased agency of the global south, acting as a unified bloc, one that's capable of driving the agenda. And the sources show that the other G20 members, who were desperate to demonstrate that the institution still worked, they were receptive, or maybe just politically unable to resist this shift in priorities.
So the G20 didn't collapse.
Not at all. It just demonstrated it could operate and find a new kind of consensus by changing its center of gravity. And that consensus was achieved by putting issues championed by South Africa right at the top of the list. It's proof that world issues can be tackled with distributed leadership from different perspectives.
I agree it functioned, but let's push on that word consensus. Was it achieved by actually solving problems or just by agreeing on the lowest common denominator?
That's the perfect question.
Did the G20 prove its resilience or just its desperation to appear resilient?
The sources suggest it's a really complex mix. I mean, the fact that the final declaration reflected priorities outside the usual U.S. mandate, that shows a genuine power shift in who sets the agenda. But as we'll get into, the real political divides, they didn't disappear. They just sort of moved to different parts of the document.
Which still feels deeply significant. The organization survived the stress test by adapting, not breaking. It confirms this wasn't just a temporary diplomatic blip. Let's pivot now, from the dynamics of leadership to the tangible results. This brings us to segment 3, key outcomes and geopolitical divides. So, despite the boycott, despite all the tension, they still managed to adopt a declaration. What was actually achieved? What were the main areas of consensus without U.S. input?
The adoption of a unified declaration was the institutional victory they needed. The source material outlines 3 main pillars of consensus.
Okay, what were they?
First, a significant consensus on robust climate action. And this went beyond just reaffirming old goals. It included commitments to accelerate technology transfer and mobilize specific financing for energy transition in developing nations.
A key global South demand.
The key demand. Second, clearly defined initiatives on global economic recovery, with a heavy focus on resilient supply chains and inflation management strategies that were tailored to non-Western economies. And third, agreed-upon language around peace efforts. The remaining members felt they had to signal that they were addressing global stability, even with all the friction in the background.
Those are enormous topics to navigate, but doing that without U.S. influence while also managing the very friction that caused the boycott. That must have put intense pressure on the language itself. Where did the limits of that cooperation show up?
This is the critical detail you really can't overlook. While they succeeded in the functional economic and environmental areas.
The technical stuff.
Right. When the declaration tried to address the true geopolitical conflicts, the language became deliberately weak. The sources call it diluted language around conflicts.
Oh. So they could agree on what to do about climate financing, a functional goal, but when it came to, say, naming specific aggressors or defining global conflicts, the text had to be sanitized to get everyone to sign.
That's it exactly. The text sacrificed specificity for solidarity. For example, instead of naming ongoing wars or condemning particular actions, the declaration would use this very abstract phrasing, something like the need for dialogue and cessation of hostilities in all affected regions.
Which lets everyone sign on while holding completely different ideas of what it means.
Precisely. Russia, China, India, European nations, they can all sign that document. And this trade-off is really the essence of the 2025 summit. It showed the G20 could function without the U.S. and can prioritize the Global South's agenda. But that functionality came at the cost of political depth. It came at the cost of directly confronting the world's most painful crises.
So the cracks are still there?
They're still there. They were just papered over with deliberately vague diplomatic language.
It's a profound tension, isn't it? Functional resilience achieved by accepting geopolitical vagueness. This has been a deeply detailed look. Let's quickly summarize the 3 key takeaways for you. First, the U.S. boycott was a profound stress test, and it proved the institution itself is, well, structurally resilient. Second, the anchor's absence led to the rise of South Africa and this strengthening spirit of global South cooperation, confirming these emerging multipolar dynamics in action.
And third, while the summit did produce a declaration on vital areas like climate and the economy, that success required diluted language around conflicts. And that shows us that this new power structure, it allows for movement, for agenda shifts, but it also places hard limits on true political solidarity when it comes to the hardest issues. You have to see this specific G20 summit as a blueprint. It shows the global order is structurally moving away from relying on a single dominant center. These new axes of power are not only capable, they are increasingly setting the international agenda.
And that structural change leads to our final provocative thought for you to chew on. If the G20 can actually pull this off, adopt a detailed declaration on climate and the economy, all without the US and with these massive divides, does this suggest that global economic governance is now permanently less reliant on traditional dominant powers?
It's the big question.
Or, and this is the flip side, does the need to use that diluted language just obscure these fundamental unresolved rifts that are guaranteed to reemerge later, maybe even more explosively because the G20 chose to sidestep them directly? It's a critical tension between functionality and conflict, and it defines the emerging global stage. Thank you for supplying the material for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.